What is up, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Not So Stupid podcast. Today we have a very special guest, Elisabeth Kristof. She is an expert in using applied neurology to move people out of pain, unwanted behavior, and trauma response and stress. She is the founder of Brain-Based Wellness, a revolutionary online platform that trains the nervous system and body to resolve old patterns, improve performance, and increase well-being. This is a very valuable perspective on an entirely new subject matter that we never really touched on the podcast: the nervous system, the brain, and how that is really the start of every action, every output, which is going to be the term we use frequently in the episode, that you do throughout the day. And any negative behavior is going to start with some imbalance in the nervous system, whether that is an emotional response, a physical response, or otherwise. You're going to learn how to identify your pain and what steps you need to take to resolve that pain. Again, whether that's a physical pain that needs mental work to overcome or an emotional pain that needs physical work to overcome, there is going to be a lot of different methods to approach this, and I'm very excited for you guys to listen to this episode. So without further ado, here is the interview with Elisabeth Kristof.
All right, Elisabeth Kristof, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Yeah, of course. It's an honor to have you, actually. I'm really excited about all the knowledge you're going to share with all the listeners today. But
I'm excited too.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. But for those people that don't know who you are, you want to give us a brief, synopsis of who you are, what you've done, and how you got to where you are now?
Sure. So my name's Elisabeth Kristof, and I am the founder of Brain-Based Wellness, which is a virtual platform that trains your nervous system to be more resilient using applied neurology, and also to process stress and emotion through the body using somatic practices. And then in some of my private training groups, we also do some subconscious reprogramming work. And how I got to where I am is I have really been a mover my whole life. I grew up training as an athlete, and I think movement at a time that I didn't even understand that movement was always helping me to regulate my nervous system and saw me through a lot of the difficult times of my life. So instinctively, I gravitated toward that as a career, and I've been in the movement and fitness industry since 2006. I had 2 brick and mortar studios here in Austin and a teacher training program and an online platform. And I started studying applied neurology in 2014 when we were building our teacher training program. And I knew enough about movement science to, at that point, understand that our brain controls everything that we experience in our body, right? We don't have a tight hip flexor. We have a brain that is telling our hip flexor to hold that amount of tone. And so until you change what's going on in the brain and in the nervous system, the results won't really be lasting. And so I knew I wanted to bring that into our programs, into our teacher training. And so I really started studying with an educational institute called Z Health in Arizona, and learning to use applied neurology for pain reduction and for athletic performance. And then I experienced a point in my life where a lot of my own behaviors and my situation got really, really stressful for me. I ended up having to leave the business partnership. It was a time of a lot of financial strain. My fiance at the time was diagnosed with cancer, and I became a caretaker for him. And there was just a ton of stress and never really understanding whether or not I was going to be okay. Losing a lot of my identity in the business. I'd been deep in my workaholism, building the business for those 12 years. And I really associated a lot of my identity and safety with the success of the business. So it was just a really, really high stress time for me. And I started to experience some really intense outputs of my own nervous system, dissociation and binge eating and chronic pain. And I started to recognize all of the signals that I saw in my clients with chronic pain when they were moving into threat in myself preceding these behaviors. And I started to really understand as I began to study somatics and learn more about how emotions and stress live in the body as well as in the brain, that our nervous system is not only responsible for our athletic performance, but it's also responsible for our behaviors and for our life experience. And I went on a long road of healing, studying with a bunch of different somatic practitioners and learning practices like EFT and different somatic practices, and realized that in order to impact change when we're stuck in loops of chronic pain or unwanted behavior or outputs like migraine, exhaustion, fatigue, then you really have to resolve stress at the level of the body, not just the brain, and that the nervous system can be trained to improve resilience and stress management so that overcoming those outputs is possible, but it can't just happen at the cognitive level. And so I started to put all of that together, and then the pandemic hit and quarantine came, and I knew that a lot of people were going to be experiencing those same issues of financial fear and health concerns, and people were going to get dysregulated. And I knew that I had to put what I had learned out into the world, and that is when I launched Brain-Based Wellness, and we've just been growing ever since.
Wow, amazing story. So lots of time in this industry, and you've experienced a lot of this firsthand, and that's why you've been able to help so many people go through this and build through it. And there's a lot I want to go through based on what you just said in your intro. But first, I think the best place to start is, what is applied neurology exactly? Like, sounds
that's
to be
a great
the focal
question.
point. Yeah,
That's
that
a
sounds
great
like a focal
question.
point, but I've never heard of it put together like that.
Yeah, so applied neurology is basically taking the latest in neuroscience and in brain research and breaking it down into very practical tools that someone could do, just like exercises that you would do in the gym to make your muscles bigger. It's exercises that you can do to train your nervous system intentionally. So our nervous system is plastic. It's always changing to the stimulus that we provide for it. So it gets stimulus, and then it integrates that stimulus, and then it produces an output. And that stimulus is also what creates change in our system. And we can decide what stimulus to put in to make that change move in a positive direction. So applied neurology, as I practice it, is really an input-based system. So our brain is always gathering information from the world around us, from our eyes, from our balance system in our inner ear, from the mechanoreceptors in our joints that tell our brain where our body is in space. And it's putting all of that information together, it's integrating it, and then it's making a decision, and it's producing an output. And your brain's primary concern is your survival. So it's always deciding safe or unsafe. And then the output that it produces is a reflection of that decision. Is it going to be a protective output, or is it going to be a performance output? And so if I can train those input systems to help you resolve your unique deficits in your nervous system, train the visual system, train the vestibular system, which is the balance system inside of your inner ear, train your body mapping system, and your interoceptive system, which is the system that tells your brain information from your guts, from your organs, and lets your brain know about how you're doing on the inside of your body, like your body temperature, your heart rate. So all those systems are sensory systems, and they're all trainable. And so if we can train those systems to provide better input for your brain and resolve the places where your nervous system has deficits from injury, from trauma, from habit, from whatever, everybody's nervous system is unique and different. So if we can train those input systems to provide better information to your brain, then your brain feels safer on a second by second basis, making those decisions and producing an output. It feels more confident that it's going to be able to keep you alive with the decisions that it makes. So the threat level, the stress level that your nervous system is under on a second by second basis reduces. And then you can handle more stress in life, more stress in your training program, more stress in your job, more stress in anything before moving into those protective outputs. And protective outputs are like pain, fatigue, muscle weakness, but it can also be unwanted behaviors like binge eating or brain fog or shutdown. And so if we can make your nervous system under less stress, then you have less of those protective outputs.
So those negative behaviors are actually our brain's way of keeping us safe and
Yes. Yeah.
stopping us from overload. right?
Yeah, that's right. So our brain, a lot of times when we're stuck in these behavior loops, it can really feel like our brain and our body are working against us. And so it
Mhm.
can be really frustrating, right? Like you want to level up your business, but you keep getting shut down by migraine, or you want to improve your training, but you keep getting injured with pain.
Mhm.
And the truth is that our body and our brain are always really trying to work to ensure our survival and to get the stimulus that they need to stay healthy and to stay alive.
Mm.
So it's really a matter of shifting that perspective to understand, like, my body and my brain is trying to tell me something. Our nervous system and our old brain have this internal wisdom that too much stress for too long is dangerous, and it causes disease and it causes mental health problems. And so it will produce something to try to get you to change your behavior to keep you safe. So pain is a really good behavior change tool of your brain that's signifying you're under too much threat for too long. Because if I'm in pain, I'm not going to take as big of steps. I'm not going to work out as much. I'm not going to have as much stimulus coming in. And as far as my brain is concerned, for whatever reason, that's better for me. That's safer for me. And so if we can understand that our brain is giving us a signal and start to try to listen to that signal and ask what it needs, then it's easier to move out of those behaviors from that perspective.
Gotcha. So this is basically our brain's language to help us understand that, hey, this isn't what you're doing right now isn't good for our survival. You need to slow down, and this is how it gets you to slow down, basically.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. And it'll speak maybe quietly in the
Mhm.
beginning. So maybe you have like a little bit of knee pain
Mhm.
or, some tension in your back. But then if we don't listen to those signals and we keep pushing through and we keep pushing through, then it has to speak louder to get our
Mm.
attention. And that's where you really start to get some severe outputs of really intense pain or even disease or like really severe unwanted behaviors, because it's not getting your attention with the softer signals. So it's going to keep increasing it until you do something to change.
Right. It's basically like when you're trying to talk to somebody and you whisper, they can't hear you. You start yelling so that they can finally hear you and respond to
That's
you.
right. That's
Right.
right.
Yeah. Okay. That's cool. I like the perspective of this. Now, you've mentioned pain a lot and it comes in several different forms. Can you break down more about pain? Because from what I'm understanding with what you're saying, pain is kind of a symptom for something else. It's the output for something else that you did, and it's not actually, the problem itself, right? It's
That's
not the root cause.
exactly right. That's
Yeah.
exactly right. So pain is an output, it's not an input. So
Mhm.
we have these receptors called nociceptors that sense threat or stress, and um, they take in information, but they're always taking in information. And then there's no one specific area of our brain that processes pain. It's this multi-area processing,
Mhm.
and there's a lot of factors that go into that decision. There's emotional components that go into it. There's like how dangerous your brain thinks something is, how much stress you're already under, and then our brain decides how to interpret those signals, and then it produces the output of pain if it thinks that it's too threatening. So if we can reduce the overall threat level that your nervous system is under by giving it better information, then it might be able to handle more before it creates that pain. So pain is not necessarily an indicator of, oh, I have tissue damage or an acute injury here.
Mhm.
Oftentimes, it's just a signal that our brain is under too much threat, too much stress, and we need to do something to reduce that stress so that the pain goes away. There's a lot of studies where they'll look at various people's structure, right? And many people have disc degeneration, but only like 40% of them experience the pain.
Mm.
And so it's not so much about the fact that our body might have a functional issue, though that can increase the amount of stress. So, yeah, you might want to do something about that, but it might not help to do something about that if that's not addressing the bigger stressors that are happening. Like maybe you have an issue with your visual system that's causing a lot of threat to your brain, or maybe you have a balance system issue. And so you can work on rehabbing your knee all day long, but until you address these bigger threat issues, that pain is still going to present. And maybe it's the stress in the rest of your life. Like when I was going through that really stressful period of my life, I had radiating pain coming from my knee and from the right side of my neck, but it had nothing to do with those places. That was just the most efficient place for my brain to signal to me that I was under too much stress.
Okay, so that's interesting that you say that. So the pain you feel in your muscles might not be a physical result of a physical stress input. It could be a mental, emotional stress input, right?
That's right. I mean, really, the truth is all pain is in our head, right? And people get like really upset when they hear that, especially if you live with chronic pain. And that doesn't mean that it's not real. It's excruciating. It's real, but it is your brain's interpretation of the amount of threat that you're under. And so that can come from those different deficits in your input systems. It's, a problem with your visual system, a problem with your body mapping system, maybe some imbalances between the nerves on the right side and the left side of your body. It can also come from emotional attachments and trauma responses to things. And it can come from being stuck in a state of chronic stress for too long.
Okay, so when you say pain is in your head, you mean that in a literal sense, like it's actually coming from your brain. It's not like an imaginary.
That's right. Which all pain comes, like even if somebody stabs me, that pain is still my brain's interpretation of, hey, there's something going on here that you need to take care of right away. It's my brain's way to get me to do something, to change my behavior, to take care of something.
Okay. And now I guess one question to stem off of this is, how do you find what is causing this pain? Because, like we said, it's not always a direct, you hurt your neck because you did something. It could be because of something you're experiencing in your life, financial strain, mental strain, overwhelm. How do you find what that actual root cause is?
So this takes a little bit of curiosity, and it takes a little bit of patience with yourself to start exploring it. And I think the best place to start is to just have that mindset shift of like understanding what pain is and understanding that it's your brain trying to keep you safe. Sometimes when people just get an understanding of what pain really is, and they know that maybe it's not so acutely threatening, just that in and of itself can sometimes make the pain reduce. Educating yourself about the neurology of pain can make your pain actually reduce. And then what I teach on the site is a bunch of different ways to train your eyes, to train your balance system, and to train your body mapping system so that you can start to provide the stimulus for your brain. And then with applied neurology, you always want to assess and reassess. And I would encourage people to do that with all of their movement programming, with all of their mindfulness practices, even like do something beforehand to take an assessment, because change at the level of the nervous system is lightning quick. It moves at the speed of electric impulse, right? So I can test my range of motion or test an exercise and see how difficult or hard it is for me. And then I can do a neuro drill. Does it make me get better or worse when I hold my gaze stable up and to the right? When I do a big eye circle, when I train my tongue, and then I repeat the exercise or the range of motion, and I see, does my body give me more range of motion through my joints? Does it give me more strength? Is the exercise easier or harder? And so you'll know right away if that's training that you need. And what I start by having people do is just identifying 4 or 5 drills that are really high payoff for them, that are providing their nervous system and their brain with stimulus that it really needs. And just doing that a couple times a day to kind of reset the baseline stress level of your nervous system can make a big difference in how much threat your brain is under on a second-by-second basis. And long-term, it's training those systems and training the area of the brain that need stimulation to function better. So that's one way. And then another really important thing to understand when you're thinking about maybe it's my financial stress or my relationship stress or emotional stress, is that all of that stuff that we experience happens in our body and not just in our cognitive mind. And it needs to be processed. It needs to be released, right? You don't want to go into threat response, stress response, and just stay there. You want to do something to shake it out. And that can be as simple as bouncing, shaking, jumping on a trampoline, something that like gets that energy out of you. And again, assess and reassess. How does it affect your unique nervous system to do that? It can be listening to a song and dancing around. It can be contact with another human being, but find some tools that make your nervous system feel better. Do I feel more relaxed? Do I feel more present? Do I feel more at ease after this? And then use it when you're experiencing those stresses to not stay in that high stress state. Because if we stay there, what happens is we start to get pushed into a really dysregulated state. So we'll move up into a high state of fight and flight or down into hypoarousal, which is like freeze. And you don't want to get pushed into those dysregulated states for too long. We're always kind of oscillating between our sympathetic and our parasympathetic nervous system, which is fight and flight and then calm and respond. So you're never just in one or the other. It's not as simple as like flipping a switch, but you want those waves to be kind of minimal and calibrated. You don't want to go way up to one end or the other of the spectrum. And so if you can start to look for signals from your body, like, wow, I'm really moving into threat response. I'm feeling that knee pain, or my jaw is clenching up, or my heart is starting to race. What are some things that I can do that calm me down? And can I listen to those signals and then take action to self-regulate so that I get better and better at not moving into those high stress states?
I like a lot of what you said. There's so many great points that we could expand on there. But I think one of the most important things that you said is assessing and reassessing what you do, and not just like doing something and sticking to it. And just because someone told you it works, you need to test it for yourself, because otherwise you don't know if it's working.
We're all so unique. Our life experiences are different. Our habits are different. Our sleep cycles are different. And so what may really work for me, and the deficits in our nervous system are different, right? Like my right eye doesn't function as well as my left eye. So I need certain stimulus that helps train that eye. You may not need the same stimulus, right? So everybody is so different. And it's really important to remember that it's okay to evaluate if something is working well for you, even like meditation. I have a lot of clients. I do a lot of trauma resolution work in conjunction with people's therapists and stuff, but I do a lot of processing of that trauma through the body. And people who are stuck in a state of hypervigilance, it can feel very threatening to sit still with your eyes closed. And so sitting in meditation in that way is not going to be right for them at first until they regulate their nervous system more. And in fact, it can push them into more of a threat response. So even things like meditation or having someone drop into their body and feel what they're feeling, again, if their body doesn't feel like a safe place first, that can also be more threatening. So it's just so important to actually evaluate, do I feel better or do I feel worse? And be the expert of your own nervous system and your own body so that you can customize your healing practice for you, for your unique nervous system.
Because you're the one experiencing it. You feel when there's actual pain. You feel when you're relaxed. Like no one's going to be a better judge of that than you at that point.
That's right.
Yeah. No, I love that. And then, we mentioned stress. And the one thing I want to touch on is the balance between, the fight or flight response and the calm and respond states of your central nervous system. I always like to take all of that into account when I work with my clients. I don't want to overstress their body in training if they have a high stressful work or life balance. If you're a single mom, you have 2 kids, you have a full-time job, I'm not going to make you train 6 days a week, super intensely. That's going to just burn you out, essentially. You want a balance of both, right? And that's kind of what you're saying, is to find that way to bring you in that calm and response state more often. Find that outlet for you that's going to work for you, right?
Yeah. So Yeah, stress is interesting because stress is necessary for
Right.
some things, right? We don't want to not ever have any stress. Stress is what causes adaptation,
Hmm.
right? Stress is what actually makes neuroplasticity occur because our brain thinks something is important and certain chemicals have to be present, like adrenaline and cortisol, for those plastic changes to occur. But and it has its benefits, right? If we need
Hmm.
to escape a threatening situation or if we need to meet a deadline, stress in short amounts can actually make our cognition better and improve our immune system. But when we get into chronic stress, that becomes a problem because then we have too much adrenaline, too much cortisol pumping through our blood all the time. And what that does is it raises our blood sugar level, our glucose in our blood, because it's preparing your body to fight or flee, right? So
Right.
once you get that fuel supply to the muscles and also all the blood leaves your organs and your digestive system, because like now is not the time to digest a meal or to like have sex with your partner. Now is the time to escape the
Hmm.
bear. And so you are losing your fuel supply to your digestive system and you're getting too much glucose in the blood vessels, which can damage the vessels over time, and it also damages the nerves over time. And so that becomes a problem, especially when we think about really important cranial nerves like our vagus nerve. So vagus nerve is cranial nerve 10 and it goes from your head down into your body, and it is really responsible for a lot of your autonomic functions like your heart rate and your respiration and your digestion, and also gives your brain signals from your body. It gives you a lot of that interoceptive stimulus. And when that pathway starts to get damaged, and then also the areas of our brain that process the information from that nerve start to not get very much activation because that nerve isn't working very well, that's a problem for our brain. So if you think of every neuron in your brain is like its own little person, it wants to stay alive and
Hmm.
it needs fuel and it needs activation to stay alive. And so the areas of your brain, like your insular cortex and the ones that integrate that information from your vagus nerve, are also not getting the fuel and the activation that they need. So those systems start to really try to get you to do things that will give them stimulus. So one way to really stimulate your vagus nerve and your insular cortex is to drink alcohol or to eat a lot. And so you get driven into these behaviors that your brain is doing to try to get the fuel and the activation that it needs because these
Hmm.
pathways are damaged by chronic stress. And it's just trying to stay alive and healthy in that moment. And then what happens is we get into this vicious cycle of then the behavior causes more stress and it goes on and on. So in a very real way, stress not only leads to disease, but it also leads to unwanted behaviors because it's affecting our brain's health. And so our brain is creating these behaviors to try to stay healthy, to try to stay active and alive. And it can be really difficult to override that if you're in a high stress situation for too long.
Hmm. So it really just wants, again, it just wants to survive. It wants to be fed. It wants to be stimulated. And that can come from unhealthy behaviors and healthy behaviors. But
That's
sometimes
right.
it just
So
goes
the
with like what's
trick
easiest.
is to really learn the healthier ways
Mm.
to give those parts of your brain and your nervous system the fuel and the activation that they need to stay healthy and alive so that you don't get driven into these unwanted behaviors. And then just like you were talking about, like with a client who's already under a lot of high stress and isn't able to release that, like for a good training session you do want a little bit of stress. It's going to make you stronger and
Mhm.
perform better. But if you're already stuck in a state of chronic stress and chronic hypervigilance, then it definitely might push you past your minimum effective dose of stress, right? So if you think of exercise like a bell curve,
Mhm.
and if the exercise is the medicine, there's like a peak at the top of the curve where you're getting the best benefits for that amount of stimulus. But if you
Mhm.
surpass that, you start to get diminishing returns, and then you go all the way down into getting negative returns, right?
Mhm.
Because then we're putting too much stress on somebody who's already overstressed. And then they might start to experience a lot of those protective outputs, pain, unwanted behaviors, fatigue. And so a really good way to to regulate that is to just assess and reassess. Like, how do I feel after I work out? Do I have more energy? Do I feel more positive? Do I perform better in the rest of my life? Or am I really tired? Do I find that I come home and I binge eat? Do I find that it makes it harder for me to stick to the habits that I want because I'm exhausted, or I feel all of this like tension and threat response? And so, just checking that, because again, everybody's going to be at a different place in that curve.
Yeah, I hear you. So even though the act of working out and training and moving your body is a good thing, still doing too much of it and putting yourself under excessive stress will still lead to negative outputs in the end.
That's right. It has to be the right dose, the right intensity, and the right type of movement for everyone. And movement is so important. As you know, like movement is really important for brain health. We are, as human beings, we were made to move. And so it is really important to get stimulants to the motor cortex, which is part of your prefrontal cortex. And so it has a big impact on cognition and emotion and, ability to retain information. Movement is just really important, but there's always like the right dose for the right person, and that the exact same type of movement may affect one person very differently than another person because of their unique deficits in their nervous system.
I hear you. Okay, so now going back to the example where we had where you're going to experience stress, and that's going to lead to, your brain wants some sort of stimulation and wants to be fed, essentially, right? And that's going to lead to an output that is either unhealthy or healthy. When you do an unhealthy output for a certain amount of time, you're doing that because it feels good, right? You're getting a dopamine response in your brain because if it's enjoyable for you to do, even though long-term it might not be beneficial. How do you kind of switch that to a healthier behavior? Because when it feels good to do those things in the short term, right? It's enjoyable. That's why we end up doing them over and over again, even though long term it's not as enjoyable, or not as helpful for us. How do we kind of shift that? Because if it feels good, we want to keep doing it. But I don't know how to say that in a better way, if you get what I'm saying.
I mean, I would say even further than that, sometimes it truly is a survival mechanism. So I'm going to go a little further in this with my binge eating. With binge eating, it literally kicks on my rest and digest system, right? My parasympathetic system. And so I am someone who comes from I have a pretty high ACE score, which is adverse childhood experience. I had a lot of traumatic events in my childhood. And then I have also, then that has become a pattern. And so oftentimes I would find myself in very high stress situations throughout my life. And so I was under this constant state of hypervigilance, and I was also creating a lot of stress. And the best way that my brain found for me to move out of that state of constant hypervigilance into rest and digest, the only way that my brain found was for me to eat a ton of food, and then it would literally shut me down. And I have actually had a moment in the not so distant future where I realized, like, there have been other people I know that have experienced that amount of trauma and have not been able to use food as a means of self-regulation, and they have ended up getting very deadly diseases or being institutionalized, or they died. And I realized that without that tool of self-regulation, which at the time was really painful, it was not very pleasurable for me to binge. And it often didn't matter what I was eating. It could just be like a cold can of beans. But I mean, really, just like you would just black out and not even understand what was happening.
Right.
But I really had this moment of deep appreciation for my body and my old brain, that it kept me alive. I felt such gratitude that my brain chemistry was such that was something that I responded to be able to move into my parasympathetic system. And to I feel like without that, having had the experiences that I had in my childhood, I might not have been able to lead such a normal, functional life. without that coping mechanism. And I was just so grateful to my body for having the wisdom to know to do that until I found other tools, other ways to process my stress and my emotions. So what that has looked like for me has been healing a lot of the deficits in my own nervous system so that I'm not under so much threat all the time from those issues. Working a lot on my respiration. Respiration is one of the best ways that you can help to regulate your nervous system and reduce the threat you're under on a second by second basis, because breathing is obviously incredibly important to our brain for our survival. It's high up there on what your brain thinks is important. And we take about 20,000 breaths a day. So if I can make those breaths more efficient, and I'm better able to practice breath competency, which is like switching in and out of different breathing systems and breathing at the right intensity for whatever task I'm doing, then I'm reducing my threat level significantly. And then I have had to learn how to experience my emotions in a minimum effective dose. So I have actually a morning practice of like using somatic practices like EFT and some stream of conscious journaling and then intuitive movement to process those emotions through my body in a little bite-sized chunk at like 10 minutes at a time, allowing myself to experience emotions and releasing them. Because just like exercise, if I do too much of that too soon, I move myself into threat response. And so I will actually get an inflammatory response. Like I'll get a fever, I'll get eczema, I'll get inflammation if I feel too much emotion too strongly, too quickly. And so I have to do that in my minimum effective dose, but I have to process that stuff through, or else it's going to keep dysregulating my nervous system and I will never be able to get out of that behavior.
So it's basically finding something that you can do to release it in a positive fashion, even if it's not like if you spend, let's say 20, 30 minutes binge eating, you don't have to do 20, 30 minutes of an opposite activity, but even like 2 to 5 minutes would be a positive step in the right direction.
Yes, that's right. I mean, that's one of the things that I really like about what you talk about on your podcast is making things really manageable for people. And I think if you are taking somebody who's already overwhelmed and telling them you have to have this 2-hour morning practice to face all these really big, scary emotions and train your nervous system in all these novel movements and stimulus, that's very overwhelming. And they're just going to shut right down. So I like to start my people with 3 minutes a day. If I can just get you to do 1 minute of respiration training, 1 high payoff drill, and then 1 minute of either like intentional, like intention setting or being in your body or emotional processing, just to start out that practice. Even just that will make a big difference in the amount of regulation that you have throughout the day. And then know that it's going to take a little bit of time. But then again, you're not pushing yourself into threat response, because that's another neurological principle. What we do, we get better at. And so if I'm always pushing through into my stress response, like pain, if I'm pushing through into pain, or if I'm pushing through into, like if I'm pushing myself so hard, I end up binging, or if I'm pushing myself so hard, I experience a migraine, then I'm actually getting better and better at creating that output, because our bodies are wired for efficiency. And the more we do something, the more well-worn that path gets, and our body's going to go there quicker to get us to try to change our behavior. So whatever I do, I get better at specific adaptation to impose demand. So it's really important to practice that minimum effective dose and to start with manageable amounts where you are not moving into the unwanted outcome.
I like the way that you phrase that, where basically you can choose to practice the positive behavior, or you are choosing essentially to practice the negative behavior and get better at that, you know, which when you put it that way, no one really wants to do it, but that's exactly how it is in the end.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and nobody wants to really do the negative behaviors in the first place, right? I mean, we're all doing the best that we can at the level of our nervous system. Most of us understand cognitively that we should get 8 hours of sleep a night, or 7 to 8 hours. We understand cognitively that like routine is really good for us. We understand cognitively the information about nutrition. Certainly we understand cognitively you don't want to stand in front of the refrigerator and like shovel food into your mouth, you know? But we're driven by these adaptive mechanisms that are trying to protect us and keep us alive. And so it's really important to have compassion for yourself about that, and to understand that it's happening at a very old brain physiological level, and you can't override that until you start to recognize it. And then, just like you said, like little bits at a time where it's possible and you're not moving into the behavior. And then change is possible, healing is possible with that mindset, but you can't just plow through it, and you can't beat yourself up about it either.
Yeah. No, I like those. So I want to take a step back to the breathing thing you mentioned earlier, because I think that's really valuable, because it's very underrated because it seems very simple, but it reminded me of a story I read recently of a Buddhist monk and how they train the children, 4 or 5 years old, how to breathe, which sounds kind of silly because you do it automatically. But, you know, when you take big, slow inhales, you're able to put yourself in a rest and digest state, right? In a parasympathetic state. When you are stressed or in a flight or flight response state, you're taking a lot of short inhales quickly. And when you can master your breath, you can kind of put yourself in and out of either state the way you want to. And it sounds kind of overly simplistic to stop and breathe for 1 minute. You know, that was the practice that you mentioned earlier, but it's been shown, you know, good diaphragmatic breathing to yield a lot of good recovery outputs, right? Do you do you find that people brush that off really easy or overlook it really a lot of the time, or what do you view on that?
Yeah, I think maybe it's, you know, it seems not very sexy and exciting to sit around and think about your breath, you know,
Right.
or it seems too woo-woo. And the truth is that it's really, really important, and it gives our brain a lot of signals about whether or not we're under threat. So if I'm hyperventilating, my brain is getting a signal that there's something to be afraid of, and then you're going to get that whole chemical response of a threat response. And so if I can stop and interrupt it and control on making my exhales nice and long and slow, then again, that will help to stimulate my vagus nerve and my parasympathetic system and move me into that calm and respond system. And then I also think that it's important to think about also to just training different types of breathing so that you can move in and out of the systems pretty fluidly, because, you know, you don't always want to be diaphragmatic breathing. You don't always want to be lateral breathing into the rib cage. Sometimes you want different breath skills for different activities. And so you just want to be able to move between those. And then one of the best things to think about is being a nasal breather. If you can just train yourself to breathe in and out through your nose more of the time, then that's actually going to go a really long way towards better breath mechanics.
Oh, I love that. So this goes back to like practicing each breath for the appropriate situation so that it becomes second nature for you at some point.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So breath is mostly unconscious, right? It just is happening all the time. But sometimes in order to train something, we have to make the unconscious conscious, right? And think about it for a little bit. And then it becomes trainable. And then it will start to change at the unconscious state.
Oh, I love that. I love the way you said that. Okay, nice. So I don't want to take too much more of your time. This has been amazingly valuable in so many ways. So I got 2 more questions for you.
Great.
If you're ready for them. So the first one is, where can people find you if they want to see more of your stuff and what you do?
So you can find me on my website, brainbased-wellness.com. And if you go to brainbased-wellness.com/podcast, you can get 2 free weeks to come try the workout and see how it affects you. And then I also have a free applied neurology course on the site where you can just learn a little bit more about how to assess and reassess what works for your nervous system. You can learn a couple drills that I use to train each of the systems that I find are generally pretty high payoff for a large number of my clients, and start to develop that little morning practice, that 3-minute morning practice.
Nice. I love that. Got that all down. All the resources that you just said, are going to be in the show notes for the listener. So if you're listening, you want to go through that, just scroll down, you'll find it. Just click the link and you'll see more of Elisabeth. Now, the last question is, this is the Not So Stupid podcast. We focus on simplicity, the minimum effective dose, like you mentioned. What is one simple thing that someone can start doing right after they're done listening to this show that will dramatically help improve their life?
So one of the quickest ways, I think, to get a really high payoff is to work with your visual system, because it's at the top of the neural hierarchy, which means the brain thinks the information coming in from there is really important. And right now, especially in this time in the world, we're all sitting looking at our screens a lot of the time, and that's pretty close to our body, right? So we have kind of this constant short-sighted vision. So one of the best ways to move out of threat response is to practice looking at an object far away. And so if you just train yourself by walking outside every once in a while in between your Zoom calls and try to find a focal point far away in the distance and focus on that, maybe watch a bird flying and see if you can track it with your eyes, so that your eyes are getting novel stimulus. They're getting trained in a skill that they're probably not doing a lot throughout the day. And also that's an eye skill that activates your back extensors, and it has some reflexive actions on your posture that's usually pretty positive. And so again, assess and reassess, but give that a try. And if you find that you get a really positive response from that, do that a couple times a day so that you're not getting all this strain on your visual system. And then another really quick visual tool is just in between some of your screen time, take your hands, close all the light out from your fingers, and just place your palms over your eyes and let everything go dark, and let all the muscles of your eyes relax, and maybe hold that for 30 seconds while you're practicing those long exhales. So breathe in through the nose, breathe out through your mouth like a straw, and try to make your exhale twice as long as your inhale while you're keeping your eyes covered. And then reassess that, because our eyes get really tired. And when our visual system gets tired, our brain makes all of us tired, because that system is really important. And our brain doesn't want us to keep going if that system is starting to shut down. And so just by doing that, you might find that you get a huge energy boost, and you have a lot more clarity and focus for the rest of your day. So maybe just squeeze that in between your meetings.
Man, I found that so insightful, because it's never something I've ever thought about, where we do and are always looking at things between 3 to 18 inches of our face, right? So that was a really cool thing to practice something you're not doing, which is essentially the entire point, right? Putting yourself in a different position.
That's right. Novel stimulus is super important for our brain and our nervous system.
Man, amazing. Oh, man. Wealth of knowledge, Elisabeth. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate this.
Thank you for having me. It was a blast to be here.
Yeah. No, it was great. So much. Please be sure to check out all of Elisabeth's work. You're going to find so much value in it. But all the listeners, thank you again for listening or viewing, and we'll see you guys on the next episode.